Been working on taking the flexible hoses off that connect between the fuel tanks and the airframe, and I've got the ones on the left wing pretty well off, but the ones on the right wing, they're stiff in there and stuck in there. Well, they didn't put as big of holes in the fabric there on that inboard rib, so I couldn't get screwdrivers in there on the hose clamps that hold them on. Well, I've got to get a real long screwdriver so I can get down in there to loosen those hose clamps up and stuff to start getting those off of there. I still got that lower one for the fuel gauge on the left wing to get off of there, but again, I couldn't get in on the hose clamp with it. Now the right wing, I want to wind up having to pull that fuel tank out of there. That upper fitting for that fuel gauge, it had a little split in it on the top of it, and I was getting the fuel line to spin on there, but it started working that nipple off of there, and that's just a piece of 1/4 inch tubing welded in there into that tank. But to fix it, I've got to pull the tank out and then have another piece of 1/4 inch tubing welded in there. I took this right wing tank out, and that looks like it'd be pretty simple because it's just a couple of straps holding it down here, and that proves not quite to be the case. There were hose barbs in these outlets where the fuel outlets go down here at the bottom through the fabric here past the plane of this rib, so you couldn't just lift that up and get it out of there. And then this hose barb here for the fuel gauge went through a grommet there. There's a plate on that rib right there. It's not on the one on the left side, it's just on the one on the right side here, so I'm not sure why that is, but that went through there, and I had to take it out of there first, which proved a little more challenging than you would think. But the main thing is that fuel tank has a tube welded through it, and it has this brace. I think these are called struts, the internal struts, internal braces that goes through that fuel tank, and you have to take that loose. I thought I was going to have to reach up underneath there and take it off from the front, but that was almost impossible to do. It can be done, but it's a pain. So it's about 10 or 11 inches, 12 inches up there past where the fuel tank goes, and you can't really get your hand in there or anything to get a wrench on that to hold on to it, so that would have been a pain trying to get that out. I was able to get it out on this side, and just enough room to slide this up here past this bay, this tube, and then slide that fuel tank off of it. Well, anyway, it all looks good. Looking at it inside there with that wing opened up, looking inside there, what I can see, everything looks really good in there, so all that looks good. Here's the fuel tank over here. It had some liquid in it when I took it off that I dumped out, and judging by the character of the liquid that come out of there, I think it was just water. I don't think there was any fuel in it. It should have been dry, but it's dry now. Well, here's the forward nipple that they put on there for that forward drain for the fuel line to go out, and then of course you have the rear one and a quick drain nipple for the quick drain back here, and then the small 1/4 inch pipe coming out of there for a nipple for the bottom of that fuel gauge. And this is the one that's broke off here. That's for the upper return line for the fuel gauge, or upper one for the fuel gauge. And I'll have to grind that off and see what I can do about welding in a new nipple in there for that. Well, meanwhile, I'm going to make sure all the gas fumes and everything get out of that. So I've had it sitting here draining for a couple days now, and I'll probably take my CO2 tank that I have for my MIG welding gun. I don't use that much for the MIG, but I can put that in there in the tank and fill that tank up with CO2 and make sure that there's no fumes in there, no gas fumes in there. So when I go to weld that nipple on there, it's safe. When I got done with that backseat heater air control box, I thought I was all done welding for the foreseeable future. I pack up my welder and my tank and everything, tore everything all down, put everything all away, and put it out of my mind. When I was inspecting the wings, come up on that right hand wing tank, fuel tank, and I noticed that there was a crack in the nipple, the hose barb where it comes out of there for the fuel gauge, And of course they broke that off completely as trying to fool with it and stuff, but wouldn't made any difference. I'd had to weld it back on anyway, or weld it up anyway. So I could see I was going to need to do some more welding. Of course the last welding that I did was stainless steel, and this is aluminum, so I needed to reset my mind for doing aluminum. Well, I needed to practice before I started on tackling that tank. Well, I needed some metal to practice on. All of the scrap that I have here is 2024, and it's anywhere from 16 thousandths to 40 thousandths. This nipple, where it comes out of there, is just a piece of 1/4 inch aluminum tubing, and that's 3003 alloy. And I don't know what the tank is. It's either 1100 or 3003 or something like that. It's whatever can be formed. I know it's not 2023 or anything like that. So anyway, I needed something of the similar alloy to practice on. So I went to town to the hardware store to see if I could find something there, and I couldn't find anything in the hardware department at all that would work. I went to the kitchen supplies, and I thought maybe I could get a cheap baking sheet, aluminum cookie sheet or something like that. And they didn't have anything like that there. But what they did have, and this is about the only thing aluminum they had, was these little small, they're 7.5 inch, 7.9 inch actually, 20 centimeters to be exact, little pizza dishes. And that's just about right. It's a little thicker than what the fuel tank is, but it's probably about the right alloy. So I got a couple of those to practice on. I cleaned this one up with some acetone, brushed it and stuff, and started practicing welding on it. And I was actually doing pretty good on there. Started out crappy, of course, but then I was doing pretty good. So I drilled a hole in here, a 1/4 inch hole, and tried my first weld on this tubing. Put a piece of tubing in there and tried my first weld on that. And that didn't work out too well. Well, I was using one of these gas lenses on this little CK9 torch, and that, of course, wouldn't get in. You couldn't get in close to this to do a kind of a T-weld or whatever you want to call that around that tubing. It had too much electrode sticking out there. So that didn't work. Well, I wound up digging out a regular lens and this small number 4 ceramic nozzle to use. And of course, my first welds on that, attempts on that, were pretty crappy. But I got better at it, and I made it work. But I've got my electrode contaminated. I've got some stick out on there. Well, I got to looking, and I ordered some ceramic nozzles of different sizes, and it just so happens I have a number 4 ceramic nozzle for the gas lenses. So I can take this back off and reset this up for a number 4 gas lens, and with that I'll be able to get in there tight against that joint there, and then I'll be able to have a little bit more stick out with the gas lens than you can have a regular one. So I'm going to change that over and try it out, and I'm not displeased with the way this weld turned out here. This would be absolutely satisfactory. That's my second attempt. Like I said, the first one I botched up pretty bad. Second attempt was better. I've got a length of this 1/4 inch tubing that came out of the other airframe. That was a vent line that ran back from one wing to the other, and I replaced that with new, and of course it had to be wider or longer for this new fuselage. So anyway, I've got this old line, I've cut it off and cut some sections off on it and cleaned it up to use for practice pieces. And then I also have a couple of sections that I cut off that have the barbed ends on them, or the bulbed ends on them, to use for the tubing to go over. So I thought I was going to have to get my beading tool out and bead one of these after I got it on there, but I've got some that already have the bead on it. So hopefully I can get this down a little better. I'll drill some more holes in here and try this again. Keep trying it until I get it close to being right anyway. Well, I've practiced welding those tubes in there. I've done it 6 times now, and the first time, of course, was a real disaster, and then after that it got better. My technique is not perfect, but the end results are adequate, are serviceable. So I think I'm ready to try welding that nipple into that tank. I've got to say, doing all this TIG welding, if nothing else, I've gotten real good at grinding tungsten. Well, there's the tank. I've had it sitting over there. Well, I've had it in dried it all out, dumped all the fuel out of it, made sure it was dry, and then I had it sitting in here beside the heater for several days now, so I'd get all the fumes and stuff out of it. I've had it sitting here for about 15 or 20 minutes, purging it with some CO2. I've got a hose on my CO2 tank, and I've primarily used this CO2 tank to purge air out of my paint cans and stuff when I do painting. The regulator's all messed up on it and stuff. I've got another regulator for it, but there's no point in putting it on there. Took and stuck it in the filler neck and then taped it off real good, and I've had it sitting in there running gas in there for about 15 or 20 minutes or more. That's a pretty good volume of air there, but that should do a pretty good job of purging any gas fumes or anything out of that. So I'll move it over here by my welding table, and we'll see if we can't get that tube welded in there. Well, moment of truth here. We've got that tank set up there, got my ground clamp on it. I guess I'll go see what kind of damage I can do here. Okay, so far so good. Got to turn that tank around now, get around the other side, I guess. Okay, that's in there. Didn't blow myself up even. Only contaminated the tungsten there just right at the end. Alright, I'm happy with that. I'm happy with that. That looks good. Okay, cool. That is really good. There it is. That's fixed. I'm happy with that. Yeah, I didn't plug the hole or anything. Okay, I put that fuel tank back in there. Actually, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to clean up this filler neck. See, the filler neck is steel, the tank is aluminum, and the filler neck is soldered in there. Well, the filler neck is pretty rusty, so I think I'm going to clean that filler neck up and paint it. Alright, the fuel tank is ready to go back in. I'm really happy with the way that hose nipple turned out on there. Get no cracks, no runs, no errors on it. That looked pretty good. I cleaned up this fuel filler neck. I wanted to take this little skirt off of there and clean that all the way up down to the aluminum and get that whole steel filler neck all cleaned up and painted. But they glued this little skirt on there with some Pro Seal or something, and I couldn't get it to come loose. I tried soaking it with acetone and I couldn't get it to loosen up at all, so I just left it on there. Now that fits around there and up against the underside of the opening in the cover for the fuel tank on the wing to keep the water and crap from going down, because the opening in the filler cover is quite a bit bigger than the filler neck, so that kind of keeps crap from going down through there. So I cleaned the filler neck up, hand wire brushed it with a small stainless steel hand brush, and then coated it with Seal, and then I just coated it with some Exo Rust black paint. So that looks pretty good. So that's ready to go back into the wing. That fuel tank is repaired and ready to go back in there. This is a strap that the fuel tank rests on here. There's two of them. They put on felt on those so the fuel tanks or the straps don't rub through the aluminum tank. There's a couple little diagonal braces. I'll run right here and one up in the forward portion here that the tank must rub on because they had felt on them too. And there's a few places here, like on this strap, where the felt's coming loose here, and then those two diagonal braces. I cleaned those off with some lacquer thinner and I let that flash off, and take some weather strip adhesive or contact cement, whatever, and glue those felts back down before I put that tank in there. And I noticed a couple of spots on these lower ribs where the tank had been rubbing on those a little bit. So I got some of that Teflon tape and I put down just strips of that right over the spots where it was showing where it was been rubbing. I got the fuel tank back in the bay there. Took a little bit of jiggery pokery to get it in there, and it wasn't too bad. Well, the fuel tank is installed. I don't have the nipples in for the outlets yet, or the hoses on there. I'm going to wait to do that until I get ready to put the wing on the fuselage. Those things hang out here a little ways, and a slight chance of getting bumped and breaking something off. so I'm not going to put those on until we get ready to hang the wing. This bolt in here, up here in this upper corner on this brace that goes across here, was a little bit of a challenge to get in there, but we managed to get it in without too much trouble. I didn't even hardly swear. These come in really handy. We had what we called sizers, which are hemostats or forceps in the Air Force, and that's one of the only things that I got out of the Air Force that I kept was old pair of sizers, and they're really handy to use. They're of course the regular size. This set here is about 10 or 11 inches long, and I got this at Harbor Freight, and it's actually a pretty good tool. Getting down into some of these spots where it's tight, you hold on the washer and slide it on and hold the nut on and stuff to get it started. It's a lot easier than short fat fingers. Anyway, I got that bolt in there. Got the straps put on. Those are a little bit of a challenge. Of course, you've got these long studs here. They're threaded on both ends. They're just an AN3 size stud or 3/16 stud, and you put a nut on both ends. These straps are steel straps with a barrel welded on them, and then this one's shorter, attached down here on the bottom to the spar, and then this one on the rear spar goes back farther. It's kind of hard getting those holes lined up to get those studs down in there, but it can be done. It's not too bad. Over on this side here, this is the first one. I got to watching it, and this felt underneath these straps is just barely as wide as the straps, maybe just a little bit wider, and it compresses when you put it in there. And somebody had over tightened this one at one time, and so there's a big indentation there on that seam, and that felt slid over the strap on this bottom section there, was contacting the aluminum on that seam. I loosened that up and tried to adjust it to get it out, but I couldn't get it to my satisfaction, so I opened it up and I put a piece of that Teflon tape in there on that just to kind of use as a buffer, or in case that strap contacts that aluminum on there. So that's one of the things you got to watch out for on putting these straps in, is over tightening them. And somebody had over tightened this one on this outside at one time. A fuel tank is dented in there, caved in there where it was. Of course it pooches up here on the top a little bit when it does that. It's got to go someplace. So you got to watch out. It's got to be tight enough that it holds the tank in securely, but not so tight that it collapses the tank. So that leads to another thing you've got to watch out for, is you want to make sure that that stud doesn't stick up above the plane of the fuel tank cover here. And that's what happened here. This one got tightened down and this stud stuck up quite a bit, so I had to loosen this one up and tighten that one down at the bottom there to get it to pull down to where that stud's not up above the plane of that fuel tank cover. So that's one more thing off the list, although that was never on the list, so I don't know, I can't really count that as being off the list then, I guess.